Onwards they fared then, the vessel lay quiet, the broad-bosomed bark was bound by cable firmly at anchor. The bore signs glistened, bright on the visors, vivid with gilding, blaze-hard and brilliant, the bore acted warden. The heroes hastened, hurried the liegemen, the land is perhaps rolling, descended together till they saw the great palace, the well-fashioned wassail hall, wondrous and gleaming. Heorot flashes in their view. Mid world folk and kindreds that was widest reputed, of halls under heaven which the hero abode in, its lustre enlightened lands without number. Then the battle-brave hero showed them the glittering court of the bold ones, that they easily thither might fare on their journey. Hello, welcome to the History and Folklore podcast, where we look at different folk beliefs through history and how these beliefs shape people's perceptions of nature. Today we're looking at colours, their associations, but also about how people saw and explained colour in the past. Because this is a massive topic, I'm going to focus it down to perceptions of colour in medieval England, between the years of about 500 to 1500 AD. I'm sure I will focus on different aspects of colour at different times and in different areas in future episodes. To help you place yourself on the timeline, in this episode I will mainly be referring to the early medieval period, by which I will mean the period between 500 AD and 1066 AD, and the late medieval period, which is the period after the Norman conquest of 1066. When we look at the past, it is easy to assume that the way people perceive the physical world around them was the same as we do today. It would be reasonable to assume that the visible parts of a rock or table or river would appear the same now as to somebody living 1,000 years ago, and that how we see objects that are in front of our eyes has survived to the modern world unchanging. If we do decide to look at the differences between how people saw things in the past compared to today, it is usually about how people perceive and explain the unseen aspects of the world, such as religious belief, spirits or angels, animism and the afterlife. We think of colours as being a tangible part of the physical world, an obvious way of describing an object to another person that almost everyone will understand. But is this actually true? The modern colour system is based on hues such as green or pink, blue or purple. With scientific advances and greater availability of dyes and pigments, we now have a huge range of colours at our fingertips. We can change our walls, hair, cars, clothes or paintings by selecting from a range of millions of different hues and shades. Although dyes and paints did exist in the early medieval period, colours of items could not be changed with the ease that we can change them today. Because of this, colour has become an increasingly abstract concept over time. In the medieval world, colour was seen as an integral part of the objects in which they were found. Their associated connotations would have been likely drawn from these. For example, red would likely have been associated with blood and green with plants, because that is where the colour was most often seen. This perception of colour as an intrinsic part of the object is reflected in the words that we use to refer to it. In the ancient world, the Latin word for colour, colare, means to hide, envelop and conceal, as it was once believed that colour was actually a thin film of material that actually covered the object. This was also true in ancient Greek and Germanic languages. In Old English there was apparently no word that translates directly as colour. Verthu, hue and blue could all be translated as colour in certain situations, but a more accurate rendition would be more likely as appearance, with colour being a small aspect of the meaning, and things like reflectivity and surface texture also being taken into account. Because of this, it is likely that gaining an understanding about different colours in the medieval period can lead to a greater and deeper understanding of their perception of the natural world as a whole. Like everything in the natural world, it was believed that colours were created through a mixture of elements, as well as through the presence of different levels of heat, coldness, dryness and moisture. Dark shades were created by a mixture of heat and either moisture as, according to Bartholomeus Anglicus in the 13th century, heat brings the moisture into black smoke, creating black humour when it burns, or dryness as, coldness constrains the parties of dry matter and fastens them together. The more heat and dryness that was present, the darker the resultant tone would be, with the greatest amounts resulting in black. Likewise, moisture and coldness cause lighter tones, eventually culminating in white. This, Bartholomeus claims, is evidence in such things as snow and frost, showing he was drawing many of his conclusions from observations of the natural world. Different hues were believed to have been created through different mixtures of the four elements of earth, air, fire and water. Green, for example, was the most liking to the sight for the coming together of fiery parties of earth. Drawing from the work of Aristotle, who created the oldest chromatic scale known today, Bartholomeus claimed that there were 7 main colours, with white and black at opposite ends of the spectrum, and yellow, citron, red, blue and purple, lying in that order, with yellow closest to white and purple closest to black. Red lay in the middle, as it was perceived to be the perfect balance of equal amounts of white and black. It is clear that Bartholomeus is aware of different hues and shades, describing 3 different shades of red known as minium, sinopis and sindraca, as well as different blues, oranges and purples. Despite this, it seems that he considered shades of white and black to be more important to colour and appearance than hue, as he spent far more time and space in his work explaining shade in very fine detail before moving on to the more broad subject of hue. There is also a sense in his work that colours were seen as having a certain psychological effect on the viewer, altering their mood or, in certain cases, physical health. Green was perceived as being a positive colour by Bartholomeus, as the brightness of fire that is in green pleases the sight, and dimness of earth and blackness comforts the visible spirit. Scholars in the Middle Ages would sometimes place green items or gemstones near to them, to look upon and rest their eyes between focusing on writing manuscripts. Black appeared to cause a melancholic mind frame, and was described as sad and dim. A colour that he refers to as wan meets with a violently negative reaction, as it was seen as being evil in men and beast, as it quenches positive heat. Wan seems to refer to a dark glossy colour that can be found in things such as raven's feathers, dark waves and chainmail. This suggests that instead of looking into the hue of the colour, medieval people tended to take a more holistic approach, incorporating surface appearance and reflectivity into their descriptions. This can be seen in the literature from the time. Beowulf is a story that contrasts between the gleaming hall of Heorot, as depicted in the extract read at the introduction of this episode, and the haunts of darkness inhabited by Grendel and his mother. In this, it is clear that light and darkness had strong connotations of good and evil, safety and danger, which set a powerful scene in the mind of the early medieval audience. The fact that the only real hue colour that is mentioned throughout Beowulf is gold, which was an important part of early medieval society as part of their system of ring-giving in return for loyalty, suggests that hue names would not have provoked such meaningful and strong imagery as dusk of night sank darkling light, and shadowy shapes came striding on. This is further evidence that shades were seen as being a more important aspect of colour and appearance than hue in the early medieval period. Interestingly, this focus on dark and light also fits into the way in which colour names are developed. Almost without exception, colour names appear in the same order across different languages and cultures. These are black, then white, red, green, yellow and blue, with other hues such as brown, purple and pink being developed later. This hierarchy of colour names matches how humans react to certain frequencies in the visible spectrum. The stronger the reaction, the earlier the colour is named in the language, meaning that we have the strongest reaction to black and white. In Proto-Indo-European language that Old English is developed from, the word for black can also be described as darkness and white as light, associations which continue through to this day. This lack of colour is also apparent in Isidore's Etymologies, written in the 7th century. In this, Isidore appears to forego any explanation of colour at all, and generally does not include any descriptions of colour in his work. One notable example is his description of the sky. Not once does he mention the colour blue, but instead says that God distinguished the sky with bright lights, and he filled it with the sun and the gleaming orb of the moon, and he adorned it with brilliant constellation composed of glittering stars. This shows strong evidence of the importance placed on the reflectivity and brightness of objects, and seems to almost entirely disregard the hue-based system that is central to the modern approach. Despite this, instances of colour being used as the main descriptive focus was not entirely unknown within this general era. In Bede's Ecclesiastical history, he conjures up rich images of sea life, including a description of mussels that provide pearls of several colours, red, purple, violet and green, but mainly white, and whelks from which a beautiful scarlet dye is extracted, which remains unfaded by sunshine or rain. Although this shows greater awareness on the use of hue for descriptive purposes, it is a rare example in Bede's work, and potentially shows that the early medieval period was a time where the shift towards a modern focus on colours was beginning. As perceptions of colour and the connotations attached are usually based on people's experiences and understanding, it is important to also take into account the terms used by normal people to describe and refer to the colours around them. This would give a more accurate depiction of the perceptions of colour held by society as a whole, as opposed to just that of scholars. It would also reflect the perceptions and attitudes of those who interacted with the landscape on a daily basis. However, this is tricky as most people are illiterate and couldn't actually write anything down. One reliable way of looking at how rural people viewed colour in the natural world will be to look at field names. As a whole, these names show a lack of colour, with only brown, black and white being used on a regular basis. Interestingly, the words for white and black had an opposite connotation to those working with the land, as black soil would have been seen as more positive due to being more fertile and likely to produce a higher yield than white soil, which is often chalky and therefore more difficult to work on. The reasons behind this apparent lack of colour is uncertain. One explanation may be that fields were named in a way that made them easy to identify, such as after an unusual tree. Colours would be unlikely to be used in this context, unless they were particularly different or worth noting. There isn't much value in describing a field as green as a way of identifying it as different from the other fields around it. Black and white soil would have been worth mentioning in a way that green grass would not. It is also possible that hue had such an unimportant role to the description of objects that words denoting the various hue colours would be limited in everyday language and would be rarely used. Another way to gain an insight into the perceptions held by most people is to look at folklore that references different hues. The issue here is that it can be difficult to pinpoint exactly when certain beliefs came into being. For example, contrary to Bartholomew's opinions about it, green is generally seen to be an unlucky colour in many parts of the British Isles. It is not clear exactly when or why this belief came about, but the unluckiness has been linked to its association with fairies, pixies and witches in various locations. The earliest known reference to green being unlucky comes from 1793, although the article refers to the idea as an old and established one, so it could potentially stretch back to the Middle Ages. Bede also references the story of a traveller coming across a patch of earth and knowing that St Oswald had been slain there, by the fact that the grass in that spot was darker than that around it, both linking the colour green with death and showing a recognition of a range of different shades. One story I particularly love comes from Argyll, where fishermen disliked a particular colour due to the fact that dye was made from the lichen and rocks, and the rocks would attract the colour back to them and cause their ships to sink and those on board to drown. This is a very clear example of the associations of colour being almost inseparable from its natural origin. In the 14th century, there was a link between the colour green and the loss of virginity. There is an account of a parson in 1351 removing the habit of a nun and putting a worldly green robe on her to allude to this idea, and by the Elizabethan era green was synonymous with pregnancy. By the 16th century, green was used as a descriptive term by Shakespeare in Hamlet to mean permanence when he says, "The memory be green," but also youthfulness and inexperience with the line, "You speak like a little green girl." This association is also shown in Arthurian romances, where a green knight is often one who is inexperienced and naive. Looking at the colours people chose to wear would also give us an indication of the importance of colour and how colours were perceived, especially as dyeing would have been a fairly laborious process. In earlier times, wool would have been darker and harder to dye, meaning for the majority of people, clothes would have been mostly the natural greys, browns and blacks of the wool or plant fibre used. White sheep became more prevalent in the late Iron Age, meaning that cloth made from this material would have been easier to dye, although darker sheep were still the most common. Linen was also a common material used in clothing, but there is no archaeological evidence that it was ever dyed in the early medieval period. This may be, though, because the pigments in linen fade far quicker than in wool, meaning no evidence of the colour is left after hundreds of years of being buried in the earth. There are many plants native to the British Isles that people could have used to dye their clothes, and people theoretically would have had a wide range of hues to select from. However, only a few colours seem prevalent in the archaeology from the early medieval period. These are yellow from weld or dyer's greenweed and indigo blue from madder, although this colour was notoriously time-consuming to create. Other dyes, such as from rust, lichen and onion peel, would have been available to the lower classes for dyeing, while rarer, more expensive plants and minerals would have been used by the upper classes. Interestingly, the red made from the well-known madder was popular in the Roman period in England but fell out of favour until the 7th century when it returned again, but usually to be used in expensive trim, probably because more expensive mordants were required for this dye to properly fix to the material without fading. It is clear from the written sources throughout this period, such as the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Bayeux Tapestry and the Luttrell Psalter, that a range of bright hues were used to colour clothes. As dyeing was a laborious and sometimes expensive process, this means that the process was deemed to be worth it, either because wearing brightly coloured fabrics was seen as enjoyable for the wearer, or because the colour itself communicated something about the wearer. There is a definite suggestion of this in the poem Piers Plowman, written in the late 14th century, in which the word red is used to describe a high-status woman, in the line, "Her robe was full rich, of red scarlet ingrained with ribbons of red gold and of rich stones." The repetition of red suggests that it was an important tool for implying status and wealth to the audience. The use of colour as a means to imply status was definitely well understood by the 13th century, as can be seen in the sumptuary laws that were first introduced in England in 1281. These laws made it illegal for people of certain social statuses to wear clothes made of specific fabrics or colours, even if they could afford them or were given or inherited them, in case they were accidentally mistaken for being part of the elite. However, it was clearly more than just colour that mattered, and the type of material mattered too, with both velvet and silk being highly prized. In the mid-12th century, Henry Huntington describes William Atheling, son of Henry I, as "clothed in silk, embroidered in gold, glittering in a glory all but heavenly." Although such materials would have held status in the medieval world due to their rarity and expense, the descriptions and surface values of such things could easily have been described by the Old English sheer or shiny. This harkens back to the descriptions found in Beowulf, suggesting continuation throughout the medieval period after the Norman conquest. The use of colour to infer status is also reflected in medieval art, particularly the use of a bright blue colour known as ultramarine blue. The pigment used to make this came from lapis lazuli, which was imported from a specific area of Afghanistan and was both rare and expensive. As a result, it was often used to infer the status or importance of certain subjects within the painting. This colour came to be particularly associated with the Virgin Mary, due to the extreme status bestowed to her, and due to the fact that it was the same colour as the sky, which came to be associated with heaven as the closest thing visible to human eyes. I have spoken about how people in the Middle Ages perceived and explained colour, but we have not yet discussed whether hues themselves are seen in the same way by medieval and modern eyes. It is clear, at least in the early medieval period, that they often took other aspects of appearance, such as reflectivity, into account as opposed to just hue when referring to colour. But when Bede talks of a beautiful scarlet dye, does he mean the same thing by scarlet than we do? Interestingly, Piers Plowman makes reference to red gold on 2 occasions, the woman mentioned in the example earlier, and to a king. The reference to gold as red may be poetic rendering, or it may be because the copper value of gold in this era was higher than in the modern world, causing it to have a redder hue. But it has also been argued that hues themselves were perceived differently in the Middle Ages, and that the colour boundaries we know overlapped during this period. For example, hues that we would deem as orange would then have been classed as red, which probably included the colour of gold. Interestingly, this difference in colour perception has been shown across modern cultures, and how we perceive colours seems to be shaped by the language that we speak, at least to some extent. There have been some really interesting studies that show that if a language doesn't have different terms for blue and green, the speakers of the language can't differentiate between the colours when shown them. Members of the Himba tribe in Namibia have no word for blue, and in an experiment could not pick out the blue square when shown a circle with 11 green squares and 1 blue. However, they do have more words for different types of green, and were able to pick out the ever so slightly different shade of green from a circle of 12 green squares that looked identical to English speakers. The fact that Old English had words like wan, which seemed to describe a kind of bluish black, and is descended from Proto-Indo-European languages that had words like gel to denote both yellow and green, may mean that the colours of the medieval world are entirely different to colours as we see them today. The complexity of this subject means it is difficult to truly get an idea of the reality of colour in the Middle Ages. There is strong evidence that perceptions of colour changed during this period, and the end of the era appears to see the emergence of the hue-based colour system which is prevalent in the modern Western world. The description of landscape in Piers Plowman that says, "I see flowers in the frith and her fair colours, and how among the green grass grows so many hues," is a world away from the polarised, shade-scented world of Beowulf. I think it is very likely that the medieval approach to colour was very different to our own, with a more holistic approach to understanding colour in appearance than just focusing on the hue. Colours, especially at the beginning of the period, were more likely to be seen as tied to the object on which it was seen, as perceptions of colour would have been derived from perceptions of the object. It is also entirely possible that colours themselves may have looked different to medieval people, who may have seen different hues and shades to the ones that we perceive today. It is difficult to gain a full understanding of all the differences and similarities in the way that colour was perceived then compared to today, but trying to do so allows us to see the natural world more clearly through medieval eyes. If you enjoyed this episode, or if you didn't, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a review and follow me on Facebook at History and Folklore Podcast or Instagram at History and Folklore, where you can give feedback, be notified of future episodes, and also discover lots of strange and unusual history and folklore facts. You can also get in touch by emailing me at historyandfolklorepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you, and I hope to see you for the next episode.